talk about taxing and the IRS complaining. Now, we have already heard how the agency's been whining about budget cuts that have supposedly compromised its ability to audit you. But now the Treasury's chiming in to say those same cuts are going to create even more headaches for you. They might not be able to get refunds out as fast or administer the financial part of the health care law that's their responsibility as well. Well, compared to what? Is it me, or is the government more concerned about, well, its own tax headaches than your tax headaches, your burdens, your rules to which you better comply, your myriad of new tax forms that you better fill out? Never mind you're overwhelmed. The Treasury Secretary says it's a bigger deal because they are.
A sustained deterioration in taxpayer service combined with reduced enforcement activity presents serious long-term risks for the U.S. tax system.
No, he did not play the role of the quiet man. That was John Wayne. That's Treasury Secretary Lou. Anyway, forget the long-term risk for the U.S. tax system. Cato tax policy analyst Dan Mitchell worries more about the long-term risk for the U.S. taxpayer. Dan, I think they've got it asked backwards here, but fill me in on what you think.
If you look at the IRS budget numbers over the last 30 years, you'll see that even after adjusting for inflation, the IRS has almost twice as big of a budget now as they did 30 years ago. Now, it's not as high as the peak in 2010 when all the fake stimulus money was being thrown around in Washington and every agency was drowning in taxpayer money. Their budgets were so blown up. But the notion that we should feel sorry for the IRS and somehow we're not going to get the right service from the IRS reminds me of the country boys I knew in college who talked about bulls servicing cows. Hey, if the IRS leaves us alone, I'll be perfectly happy.
Careful, there's a movie about that too, but I'll think about it. Deliverance. Here's what worries me, Dan, that what they're trying to say is if you're not getting this or you're waiting for this, they're telegraphing it. They're doing some pre-Heine covering. And that worries me too. What else aren't they saying, or what else potentially are they bracing us for?
The IRS has almost 100,000 employees. As I said, their budget is almost twice as big, adjusted for inflation, as it was 30 years ago. The notion that they're claiming that they somehow can't competently enforce the tax code, well, maybe if they didn't spend so much money participating in an illegal rewrite of the Obamacare law, maybe if they weren't trying to influence American elections by political biased approval of different nonprofit groups, maybe if they just focused on their core mission, they would have plenty of money to enforce the tax code. And I say this as someone who doesn't necessarily blame the IRS because it's the politicians that have given us the 76,000-page tax code. And that, of course, is a burden, not just on us, but, the IRS doesn't know how to enforce that either.
By the way, if any of you at the IRS are watching this segment right now, Dan is the one saying all of this horrible stuff. I think you're just doing a fine job myself. But, Dan, here's another thing that kind of interests me on all of this. To be fair to the IRS, they have the financial burden of doing a lot of the financial part of the health care law. Now, I thought we hired 60,000 IRS agents to do this, and that was going to be enough to cover it. It seems to me that Treasury Secretary Lou, who was not John Wayne and the quiet man, just so people at home would know, understand that that might not be enough, or what?
We definitely have one of these, immovable objects, irresistible force conflicts. Because the tax code is such a mess, and because things like Obamacare are now supposed to be enforced by the IRS, we have to fundamentally choose. Do we either basically give massive power and massive budgets to the IRS and basically let them tell us how to live our lives, or do we basically resist and tell the politicians, no, we've had enough. We don't like the fact that our lives are being looked into. We don't like the fact that we have no privacy. We don't like the fact that we give up our constitutional presumption of innocence when dealing with the IRS. Maybe you guys in Washington on Capitol Hill and the White House need to fix some of the mess in the tax code. As far as I'm concerned, I would much rather force them to change the tax code than to simply give more money to the IRS to try to prop up a system that, if we leave it on autopilot, we're going to wind up being grease.
All right, Dan, thank you very much. For those who don't know at home, Dan was the inspiration for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.